Good morning. This is James Powell, Chief Technology Officer for Thomson Reuters, and welcome to another edition of TechVision, where we try and find interesting technologies and trends that will impact our business to talk about. Thomson Reuters is a proud sponsor of the MIT Center for Digital Business, which is a research initiative that analyzes the business uses of the internet and other digital technologies. And today we're very lucky to have two special guests. Erik Brynjolfsson is the Schussel Family Professor of Management Science and the Director of the MIT Center for Digital Business at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And Andrew McAfee is a co-director, an initiative on the digital economy, and a principal research scientist at the Center for Digital Business. These, our guests are co-authors of a brand new book, The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. And that's going to serve as the basis for today's TechVision, so I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's a really important topic for both us and our customers. So please welcome Erik and Andy.
Thanks, James. I'm Andy, and I'll be kicking off this morning. And I'd like to open by talking about why Erik and I decided to write this book and why we've been doing what we've been doing for the past 3 or 4 years back at MIT. And the reason is actually very simple. We got confused. And we got confused because technology started doing things that technologies were not supposed to be able to do. And they started doing them more and more often, more and more quickly, more and more broadly. And the landscape of technology just started to look really unfamiliar to us. And we said, we got to understand this and go out there and try to figure out what's going on. And the book represents our attempt to try to figure out and explain what's going on. But let me try to make concrete this notion of technology surprise. And to do that, I've got to do something I'm not terribly proud of. I've got to throw a couple colleagues of ours underneath a bus. And I should be clear, I've had colleagues who I'd be really, really happy to throw under a bus, but not these guys. This is where we were in 2004. This was a fantastic book written a decade ago about, as it says, the new division of labor. And the division they were interested in was between what people are good at versus what machines are good at, and therefore what tasks will each be doing, not just in 2004, but for a long time going forward. And I want to stress, this was the absolute state-of-the-art work at that point in time. Erik and I both read it. We nodded our heads at each other. We taught it to our students. This was the best we had to work on just a decade ago. And the authors here said, look, the comparative advantage of people is not adding up long columns of numbers. That's a completely routine task. Give it to the technology. The stuff where people have a sustainable comparative advantage is in these two deeply important areas of pattern matching. Our brains are pattern matching computers. And because we're such a social species, we have amazing communication abilities, very nuanced, very complex, that the technologies are just never, ever going to be able to catch up with. So in the economy and the workforce of the future, the computers will be doing the really boring routine stuff, and the people will be doing the work that requires some combination of pattern matching and complex communication. Makes perfect sense. Exhibit A of a pattern matching task that we people do very consistently and very well that would be impossible, or at least not foreseeable, for technologies to do in 2004 was driving a car in traffic. We see where this is going, right? The reason Erik and I are grinning like morons in this picture is we just finished a trip down Highway 101 in Northern California in a car that had absolutely no driver. We called in all of our favors at Google and said, please, 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 can we have a ride in one of these autonomous cars we've heard so much about? And they grudgingly said, yeah, okay. So we're going down Highway 101, and there's a Google engineer driving the car and to start out the trip. And honestly, just like you'd imagine, there's seriously a big red button in the middle of the dashboard of this car. And at some point he hit it, and he took his hands off the car, and we started driving autonomously. And it was fantastic. It got really, really, really interesting when the traffic ahead of us came to a dead screeching halt, which happens on the 101. And suddenly I found myself wondering about the exception handling abilities of the Google driverless car and hoping that they were really industrial strength. And sure enough, they were. The car braked to a stop. We waited there with the rest of the stop-and-go traffic. And then when the traffic picked up, the car smoothly accelerated. We kept on going down the road. And when we got done with the trip and we were done taking moron pictures of each other, Erik and I kind of looked at each other and said, why are people still driving cars? Now, this car can't do everything yet, can't drive in all conditions, can't handle everything. But we got a glimpse of what technology can do in this area of pattern matching under high-risk situations. And we came away convinced that things really were different. What about complex communication, this alleged superiority that we have in communicating with each other? Here is an earnings announcement that we grabbed from the Forbes website just a little while ago. This one happens to be an earnings summary from Nike. It was written entirely by an algorithm, no people involved. The company here is named Narrative Science, and we were talking with the founders, and they said, what we do is pretty simple. If you give us a body of data, we don't care what the data is about. Corporate earnings, the performance of every one of your branches, if you're a franchisor, the box score of a baseball game, we don't care. We will write a clean English prose narrative about that data. And it will have a voice, the story will have an arc to it, it will be grammatically perfect, and we can crank these things out time after time, very close to zero marginal cost. And for all 162 Red Sox games, for example, you will not be able to tell that they came out of any kind of cookie cutter. They will read differently enough that we can fool you over and over again here. So when I start to think about this alleged superiority that we have in pattern matching and complex communication, I become a little less certain that we humans hold out the high ground in all cases. In particular, when we see some recent examples of combining these two abilities, pattern matching and complex communication, things start to get really interesting, because I would have thought that that combination is where humans have the high ground. When we combine our pattern matching and our communication abilities, surely in that case, we're going to be ahead of anything that digital technologies can do. Do any of us here want to confess to being big enough nerds that we sat around just about 3 years ago and were spellbound by watching Watson play Jeopardy? There are many big nerds in this room. This is fantastic. I didn't leave the house for 3 days because I was so worried. Even though Jeopardy's regularly scheduled, I couldn't take the chance, right? I wanted to watch Watson play Jeopardy against the two best human Jeopardy players of all time, including Ken Jennings, who won, I believe, 73 times in a row. He took home more than $3 million. He became something like an American folk hero as a result of playing Jeopardy. And so this was kind of a John Henry versus the steam engine moment. What would happen when Watson, this technology, went up against the two best human Jeopardy players ever? And the reason this was a really tough test of human ability, those of us who are Jeopardy nerds, and I won't embarrass anyone by calling them out, but we know that Jeopardy is really kind of easy to play at a mediocre level and extremely difficult to play at a high level, because you have to have a huge base of knowledge about so many different domains. They don't tell you in advance what the domains are going to be, and they deliberately often ask the question in a way that makes you go, huh? So you've got to unpack what they want before you can even try to access your memory banks and answer what's going on. Don't take my word for it, though. We're going to play not one round. We're going to play one question worth of Jeopardy to see how hard this game is to play at a high level. And we're going to do it Jeopardy style. I'm going to flash up the answer. You're going to give the question, obviously. I'm going to flash up the answer. I'm going to read it out in my best Alex Trebek imitation. When I'm done, if you know the answer, just shout it out, because we couldn't pass out buzzers to everybody. Ready? One question worth of Jeopardy. Here we go. William Wilkinson's An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia inspired this author's most famous novel, Go. Now see, we had two very different answers here. For those of us watching at home, the first answer shouted out was Dracula, which A, is not phrased in the form of a question, and B, is not correct. Because even though our respondent got the name of the novel right, that's exactly right, the question is actually asking for the author. So you gotta unpack the question before you can figure out what the heck is going on here. This is why this game is so difficult to play. So this is a really stern test of human abilities, let alone the kinds of stuff that computers can do, and it turns out it wasn't even close. Over the course of a 3-day tournament on TV, Watson took home more than 3 times as much money as either of the two human competitors. These guys were the absolute best knowledge workers in their strange little industry. and they got steamrolled by a piece of technology here. So I become a lot less confident that we just are going to continue to hold out the high ground in these allegedly uniquely human areas. When we talk about this, one of the first pushbacks we hear, which is accurate, is what about the physical world? What about about robots and the things that we humans can do easily, like walking across a room, recognizing where the pen is on the table, picking it up? And it's true, these tasks are still hard for robots to do, really hard. But what's amazing is how quickly they're getting better. This is where we were with robotic progress in 2006. This is one of the great failed demos of all time. You did not want to be working on this project on this day. This was Asimo. He is a humanoid robot made by Honda, and Honda spent decades working on him. They got so confident in his abilities that they rolled out a set of stairs on stage in Tokyo in 2006 and said, Asimo, walk up the stairs. He got about halfway up, fell over backward, and face planted. And this is where we were in 2006 with our cutting-edge robotics abilities. This is where we are in 2013 with our cutting-edge robotics abilities. The Terminator is not that far away, right? This is another Japanese robot, actually, that was the winning contestant in the latest Grand Challenge sponsored by DARPA, the research and investment arm of the Defense Department. They're having a grand challenge about humanoid robots to do things like open a door, climb up a rubble field, climb a ladder, get into a car and drive it. I mean, they really don't need us to drive cars anymore, it appears. And while none of the robots were perfect, they did surprisingly well on these very, very human tasks. So when I think about work in the physical world, we absolutely do still hold out the high ground in some areas, but the technologies are gaining very, very quickly. And to make that more evident, I want to show my all-time favorite graph about the second machine age, about this period that Erik and I think we're in, of just astonishing technological progress that is broad, deep, and really, really fast. To make that clear, let me draw you my all-time favorite graph. This is data that comes from IBM, and it's data about human Jeopardy champions versus Watson. And these are the human Jeopardy champions. Every one of those dots represents a champion, the winner of an episode of Jeopardy. And you notice how they're all clustered up to the top of the graph? That's because the vertical axis here is accuracy. You cannot win on Jeopardy and get a lot of questions wrong. Just doesn't work. So every champion is pretty accurate. And then you really want to be over to the right as well here, because that's aggression. That's how many questions you try to answer. So these are human champions. These are Ken Jennings. So you can see that even by comparison to other champions, Jennings was the Michael Jordan of Jeopardy. He was just in a league of his own. A lot of us are pretty convinced that he was genetically engineered and raised from birth by ninjas only to play the game of Jeopardy. You see his comparative abilities really clearly on this graph. Now, here's where Watson started out. This is Watson in December of 2006. And the reason Watson is a line instead of a point is you can tune him to be either more accurate or more aggressive. So he's got a line instead of a point. But you notice that line is not threatening to human Jeopardy champions at all. Watson is a joke. Any of us could have beaten Watson at this point in time. He was just laughable at the game of Jeopardy in December of 2006. And then what's really interesting is how quickly Watson got better. Because you notice how his line changes, how his frontier changes, month by month, over the course of less than 4 years. So that by the time we've got our last line drawn here in November of 2010, that's less than 4 years later, Watson is squarely in human champion territory. And he's not quite in Ken Jennings on a good day territory, but he's threatening a lot. And then we know that by the time they aired the episodes in February of 2011, what the result was, absolute steamrolling of Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter by Watson, by the digital technology. And the final great thing to say about Ken Jennings, before I turn it over to Erik, is that he had a lot of insight and a sense of humor about the whole thing. Because when he put up his final Jeopardy answer, and by the way, he got it right, it was Stoker, not Dracula. When he got it right, he added a postscript that I think is kind of interesting for the era that we're heading into. He said, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." So with that, let me turn it over to Erik, because what we'd also like to talk with you about is, what does this progress mean for the economy? Erik?
Thanks, Andy. It's good to be here as a fellow computer serf, along with Andy and the rest of you. Fortunately, I think that our new computer overlords could be very benevolent in some ways, but there's also some challenges that they're going to bring. On one hand, I think that the technology, and we've seen, is going to bring a tremendous amount of bounty. And so let me talk a little bit about that first. The picture on the right here, on the left there, is an ad from Radio Shack back in 1993. And someone sent it to me, and an interesting thing they pointed out was that just about every product on that ad for sale is now available for free as part of your smartphone. It's an app on your smartphone. There's a music player, there's a camera, there's a video camera, there's a GPS. There's a whole set of technologies, actually some that weren't even available back then. And that's wonderful. That's giving us a lot more access to goods and services, implicit wealth that we didn't have before. The other chart is an app that's just being developed that helps detect cancer, in this case, skin cancer, quite accurately. There's a related technology called CPath, computational pathologist, that is able to go through photographs of breast cancer images, radiological images, and identify the markers for breast cancer. In fact, they showed it tens of thousands of images, and it picked out the 8 main markers that human pathologists had been trained to identify for breast cancer, but it learned it on its own. What was even more striking was it also picked up 3 additional markers that no human had ever recognized before. So it surpassed what humans had been able to do. This is bringing a tremendous amount of bounty in terms of the goods and services that we have access to, our health and lifespans, some of which show up in GDP, some of which don't. In fact, if you go through all the free goods and services that we have available today, you realize that our official GDP statistics in many ways underestimate the bounty that we're getting. Wikipedia is 10 times larger than Britannica. It's free. It provides access to people all over the planet in a way that we didn't have previously. But it contributes essentially 0 to GDP because it's got 0 price. So when you multiply it by however many units are consumed, it still ends up to be a big 0. And a lot of our economic statistics are in turn based on that. GDP per capita, productivity growth, all of those things don't take into account this explosion of digital value. So we've done some analysis at MIT, and we've concluded that there's about $300 billion worth of missed value because of the digital economy not being measured in our official GDP statistics. And we need to fundamentally rethink how things are calculated for the digital economy. So that's part of what's happening. And in the book, Second Machine Age, we spend some time talking about the economic implications of the bounty. But there's another part of it, which we call the spread, which is that these digital technologies also have an effect on the distribution of income. And you've undoubtedly heard about how middle-income consumers have not been getting an increase in income the same way that the top 1% have, or the top 1/10 or 1/100%. And this is the spread that we see growing increasingly. So what's going on? How can we understand what's going on here? Well, our view, which we first articulated in our previous book, Race Against the Machine, and we fleshed out in the Second Machine Age, is that the way you can have both bounty and spread is that the digital technologies are in fact making the pie a lot bigger. They're creating a lot of wealth, but not all of that wealth is necessarily evenly distributed. And in particular, a lot of the skills, the technologies, the organizations that are needed to take advantage of these technologies aren't keeping up with the advances in technology, so a lot of people are falling behind. And you see this in some of the economic data. It's quite striking. Andy and I call this the great decoupling. If you look at this chart of 4 key indicators, productivity, employment, income, and real GDP, you see that for much of the 20th century, they rose more or less in lockstep. They were tightly coupled. GDP went up, but so did median income, so did employment. And then starting in the 80s, you see that median household income started kind of becoming a little bit decoupling. And then in the 90s, so did employment. So that today, median income is lower than it was in the 1990s, the person at the 50th percentile. And the employment to population ratio, the share of people working, has also fallen. This was happening even before the Great Recession. It was you could see the decoupling happening there. So the implicit contract that we've had, that there was this rising tide, this improvement in technology that we all shared in, seems to be violated, and we are not having that continue recently. The hard truth is that while digital progress does make the pie bigger, it is creating wealth, it's not stagnating the economy, there's really no economic law that says that everybody's going to necessarily benefit from that. It's entirely possible for the pie to grow and for some people to end up with a smaller share than before. Now, in the 1800s and much of the 20th century, that share of people who maybe weren't participating was very, very small. If you were making horseshoes or buggy whips, maybe you didn't benefit from the introduction of the automobile. But by and large, the vast majority of people did, and even those who didn't, relatively quickly were able to find new jobs, new applications. Today, the share of people who isn't participating is much, much larger. The data say it's at least half the population. By some metrics, it's 80 or 90% of the population that's not participating. And you can see how this creates a lot of unease or even anger in the United States, in Western Europe, in Japan, really worldwide, about the stagnation of these median incomes. Diving in a little bit more specifically, we can see three broad technological reasons why we're having this decoupling and this growing inequality and lack of employment. And economists call these three skill-biased technical change, capital-biased technical change, and talent or superstar biased technical change. Let me briefly describe each of them. So the first one is this growing gap between high-skilled workers and low-skilled or medium-skilled workers. And this chart by David Otter and David Dorn illustrates it quite well. What you see is that, again, in the early part of the century, all these different groups had rising incomes together. Whether you had a high school education or a graduate school or anything in between, people were getting wealthier together. Then there was the oil shock, the recession in the 70s, and everybody kind of took a hit together, although you begin to see things separating a little bit. And since then, the incomes have really fanned out quite a bit. People with graduate education or college education have resumed the growth in incomes, whereas people with only high school or even some college haven't done as well. They've stagnated or even fallen in absolute terms. And what's striking is that this shows up not just in these official statistics, but we went in and looked at some of the other statistics. For instance, in health and life expectancy, I was shocked to find that the average person with a high school education today actually has a shorter lifespan than they did 15 years ago, even though overall lifespans has grown. So it's showing up on a lot of different metrics. And if you dive in a little bit more deeply, what you see is that it's the middle skill income people, middle skill people who have been hit especially hard. This bowl-shaped chart plots what's happened to employment across the skill spectrum, from those who have had the lowest wages to those with the highest wages, and the lowest skills to the highest skills. The one on the other side does the same thing for wages. They both look kind of similar. They're these bowl-shaped charts. What you see is that the people at the very high end and the low end have done relatively well. The people in the middle have had the biggest drop in employment and wages. And the research indicates that that's because most of them are engaged in what we call routine information processing work. Things like tax preparers, payroll clerks, simple accounting and bookkeeping, different kinds of clerks and different kinds of secretarial or middle management work. At the high end, some of the creative jobs, they've actually done very well. Some of the professional jobs have done very well. We saw that in the earlier chart with the 1%. It's also interesting, perhaps a little surprising, that at the other end, there hasn't been as much of a hit. A lot of those jobs involve physical work. They could be janitors or massage therapists or hairdressers, cooks, gardeners. These tasks, despite some of the progress in some of the robots that we saw that Andy described earlier, they're still, by and large, aren't machines that can navigate through a room, that can do fine motor control. And so those jobs have been relatively unaffected. We did see a self-driving car, but nonetheless, truck drivers still have not been affected in a big way by automation. Although it's not hard to see a path where the technology will start affecting them in the next 5, 10, 15 years. The other big change, the second big change that we've seen, is a redistribution between capital and labor. Again, the pie is getting bigger, but not everyone's getting an even consistent share of that. So here's a chart of the share of GDP going to capital and labor. The red line in particular is the share going to workers in wages and other forms of compensation. It bounces around a little bit depending on the business cycle, but there's a little bit of a downward trend, and then especially in the past 10 years or so, you see it's just beginning to sort of really steeply fall off a cliff. Part of that was with the recession, but even before that and after that, it's been falling quite steeply. And in some ways, this even underestimates the effect, because this includes all labor. This includes CEOs, it includes professional sports stars, it includes movie actors, as well as other kinds of labor. So you put them all together, and there's still a net decline. Meanwhile, corporate profits, the return to capital, are at a record level today. There was a dip here you can see from the Great Recession, but that was relatively short-lived. And so more and more of the returns going to capital. And again, you can see how technology plays a role in that. If you take a factory like Terry Gou did in China, and you work to replace 1 million human workers with 1 million robots, that can create great efficiencies, increase productivity, lead to more output, perhaps higher quality. It also leads to a bigger share of the returns going to capital owners and a smaller share going to laborers. And then the third group, which is perhaps the most important one, and it hasn't been studied quite as much, but I want to describe it a little bit, is the way that income is shifting, especially to superstars. We're seeing more of these winner-take-all markets. And you see it in many different industries. You see it obviously in music and media, where superstars are getting huge returns, and that's been happening for a few decades now. You see it in software. This is Scott Cook. He's a billionaire. His company Intuit makes a number of products like TurboTax. Let's think about what TurboTax does. It provides tax preparation services. I hope you guys are almost done with your taxes now. Many of you are probably using different kinds of tax preparation software. There has been an ability to take a process like that, codify it, digitize it, and once you've digitized it, you can make a copy of it. Then you can make 10 copies. You can make 100 million or 1 billion copies of it, and it costs almost nothing to do that. And each of those copies is a perfect replica of the original. And each of them can be transmitted anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world almost instantaneously. So digital goods are free, perfect, instant. Those are characteristics we haven't had for other goods and services in the economy. And they lead to winner-take-all economics. If you have the ability to buy tax preparation software, you may as well buy the best one, or at least one of the top few if you have some customized needs. It's not likely that the 100th best or the 1,000th best tax preparation software is going to have any significant market share. When you have winner-take-all or winner-take-most markets, you get a big concentration in the returns to it, compared to, say, having human tax preparers where there could be tens or hundreds of thousands of people each serving a small local market. They can't scale up their services the way you can with digital goods. Now that's true for software, obviously, it's true for music, but it's increasingly true for every industry. Mark Andreessen put it poetically when he said that software is eating the world, and by that he meant that the core of more and more industries, the core of finance, of manufacturing, of retailing, of almost every industry is becoming digitized. And that means it's having more and more of those same kind of digital economics, those winner-take-all economics, where you can create broad distribution of your good or service to lots and lots of people, but you also have a real concentration of the winners. And we're even seeing it in CEO and senior executives, where companies are able to scale their senior talent, their professionals, across a global marketplace in a way that they couldn't previously. This is showing up as well in the data quite strikingly. Thomas Piketty has a new book that just came out called Capital, and earlier he wrote a series of papers with Emmanuel Saez, and they documented how the share of income going to the top, earlier I showed you the top 1%, this is the top 1% of the top 1%, and there's almost like a fractal equality. The higher up you go in the income distribution, the steeper the concentration has been, and they are now at record levels of concentration. Early in the 20th century, there was also a local peak there. And this reflects, in part, these superstar economics that people, whether they're the guys who founded WhatsApp or Instagram or Facebook or other products, and increasingly throughout the economy, are able to scale up their talents or maybe their luck and reach very broad audiences. So what's to be done? It'd be interesting to hear from all of you about some of your thoughts about how we can boost the bounty and mitigate the spread, create more shared prosperity and equality of opportunity. Our view is that just as there was a grand challenge that helped create the self-driving car, and another new grand challenge that creates robots that can do a lot of different kinds of tasks that the technologists have responded to very effectively and create these wondrous, almost science fiction level technologies. We need a new grand challenge that addresses the social and economic implications of these technologies. I don't think that those of us in management and economics have been keeping up our share of the bargain in terms of being able to figure out the new economic system, the way we can take advantage of these technologies to create more shared prosperity. We're quite confident that the digital technologies will continue to accelerate. In fact, those amazing technologies that Angie showed you a little while ago, those are not the crowning achievements of the second machine age. Those are just the warm-up acts. The disruption we've seen in the past 10 years is significant, but it's nothing compared to what we're going to see in the next 10 years and the 10 years after that. But our skills, our organizations, our institutions are lagging. Humans don't change as fast as technology. So as we have this faster technological change, we need to double and redouble our efforts to figure out how we can keep up with them in terms of reskilling the workforce and changing the way we do work. If we just do nothing, if we just do business as usual, that gap is going to grow larger. More people are going to fall behind. Median income is not going to keep up. And we're going to, even if the pie gets bigger, we're going to have more uneven distribution of income. But we don't think that's inevitable. We think that there are things we can do, and part of the reason we're creating a new initiative on the digital economy is to help figure out ways that we can race with machines as opposed to against them. We can use technology to augment our skills, to allow us to do new things we couldn't have done previously. And I'd be interested, and I think maybe we can all come up together and hear a little bit from some of you as to what the challenges and opportunities you all see, and hear a little bit about what your concerns and questions are. So with that, why don't I wrap up and let's have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We can go to questions in the audience, or I've got some questions, or we can...
Well, why don't you start? I'm sure you've got some ready to go.
I have a few. There's obviously a key theme in your book around education and how that could potentially solve some of these problems. And I think we'd be very interested to talk about not just education. Well, I'll take a step back. When I read your first book, I talked to Thomson Reuters management about that book and said that it kept me up at night because I've got kids. And you mentioned that in your book, but that's the first question anybody asks. So I think everybody in the room who's got kids or thinks about that probably worries about the impact for their kids. Sure. But I'm also interested in the impact for corporations. What are the answers for education? What changes around education, both from a school perspective and a company perspective?
There's kind of, when I look at it, I see both bad news and good news. The bad news is that education is a big, kind of a monolithic, very slow-moving industry. And I think that's true both at the primary level and at the level of higher education as well. And it feels to us like, I'll concentrate on primary education. The goal is to turn out the exact kinds of workers that we needed a century ago, right? The people that Henry Ford needed were, fairly disciplined, obedient people who could do fairly simple things, and maybe if they rose up to the level of clerk, they had to do arithmetic and read and write a little bit. And the way you trained them to do that was by sitting them in a classroom that was where the desks were in a grid, and you inflicted subject after subject on them to prepare them for a life of tedium in the factory or something. I mean, I'm being a little bit cynical, but honestly, only a little bit cynical. And that's still the dominant model. There's been tinkering with it, but that's still the dominant model. So I think that's the bad news. The good news is that when we look at what technology and networks are doing to education, what they can do to education, we see a lot of really cool, end runs and chipping away at that monolith of higher education. So we've all heard of things like Khan Academy. We've all heard of things like MOOCs, or massive open online courses. We're seeing that there are these really different ways to go about imparting skills to people. And if the kids or their families out there are interested in this, there are completely unprecedented resources out there. Things didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago that they can take advantage of. My single favorite example of that is MIT made some of its courses available as a MOOC, and we found this 16-year-old kid in Mongolia who got the highest grade out of thousands of people on our introductory circuits and signals course, which is not an easy course at all. So, not being morons, we admitted him. And there's this Mongolian kid at MIT. That's a great example. Let's see a lot more of that.
Right. You talk about Montessori schools and how that's interesting, but I don't think all of us can send our kids to Montessori schools. Do you think it's about an education initiative or do you think it comes from top down, the way you treat your kids, the way you encourage your kids to do things like Khan Academy?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot
how does
more
it scale?
widespread.
I'll let the parent answer this one.
Yeah, Khan Academy is very scalable, obviously, and the interesting thing about it is that it's not just that we've figured out MOOCs or whatever, that's the solution. The more important thing to understand is that there's a methodology, which is a methodology of experimentation and continuous learning. You look at the way, say, Amazon or Google or any of the digital companies run their businesses. They are running literally hundreds of experiments a day. Amazon runs about 200 experiments a day. And one of the things that makes me excited about education is we're beginning to bring that mindset to education. So by no means do I think that we've figured it out with our MIT X course or any of the other ones. We have some great possibilities. Some of them are failing miserably. Some of them are working wonderfully. In the case of that circuits course, in addition to bring that kid over from Mongolia, discovering the fact that this was available for free and he was able to take that course over there, it's also been a great tool for Anant Agrawal, who's teaching the course. He's learning. He has megabytes, gigabytes of data in real time about how people are using the course. And he's discovering that people don't always learn the way he thought they were going to learn. He had a set of lectures all prepared. Each of them followed with a problem set. And he imagined people would listen to the lecture, then do the problem set, and so on. So he looked at the data, and it turns out, he was a little disappointed at first, that most people just skipped his lecture and went right to the problem set. But then, after they fiddled with the problem set, they realized they couldn't really solve it. They'd go back to the lecture and listen to it, bounce around parts of it to help them solve the problem. It was a much more dynamic, interactive process. It made him rethink, reconceptualize how he was even designing the course. And he discovered that different people had different learning styles. So you have the opportunity now to not just raise the level of education, but put it on a higher improvement trajectory and to customize it to different learning styles. That's something that maybe we could have done in the 20th century, but it was very hard to do that in an analog environment where you have a test at the end of the semester or whatever. Now, literally real time, we're getting data about what's working, what's not working. And so I can't help but be optimistic that mentality will pervade more of education. Some of it will come top down, but a lot of it is really bubbling up from thousands of experiments.
And what's super interesting is how these educational innovations, which have technology all over the place, how they're going to intersect with this big, slow-moving, monolithic industry. Stay tuned.
Yeah. So, obviously, talent is a key part of how Thomson Reuters is successful, a very key part. How do enterprises think about that? Where are the innovative companies that are thinking about how they're going to take their workforce down this journey?
The main thing that I'm excited about is we're seeing some enterprises who are moving away from the old signals about talent and about human capital. The classic way you hire somebody is you grab their resume and their cover letter. Did they go to a good school? Did they have a high GPA? What does their employment history look like? Do they have a couple good letters? Okay, fine. Interview and then you hire them. That system really doesn't work very well at all. When companies like Google have been analytical about their own processes, and especially their human capital processes, they find that system really does a poor job. So what's happening, what we're seeing glimmers of instead, are these very different signals of someone's quality on the way in the door. So for things like coders, some of the smart companies we talk to in Cambridge and in Silicon Valley are ignoring transcript and GPA, which makes us nervous as people who teach at MIT, right? But they're starting to say instead, well, okay, do you have a GitHub score? What is it? Do you have a top coder score? Have you contributed to some of these open, can we look at your code and get signals that way? There are other companies that are doing really innovative ways to see what people's actual skills and abilities are. And as more companies like Thomson Reuters use those signals more and de-emphasize the old signals that don't work very well, that's going to provide a lot of opportunity.
It's part of this measurement revolution that's happening in every industry, that not just the digitization, but the datafication of every industry. And it's been said that data is the lifeblood of science, and really
it's
progress.
been said by me, actually. I think that's my quote.
Yes, I think you were the first to say that. And so
I think I was.
We can check the data on that.
Someone look that up, would you?
So I think Lord Kelvin may have said something similar at one point.
Yeah, to hell with him.
That is great, because much of industry has really been run from the gut and from intuition, and now we have the ability to actually measure what's working and what's not working. And education is just one example of that. It's happening at K through 12. It's happening in college. It's happening vocational. There's lifelong learning. Industries, businesses are doing that. We have a course. We have a whole set of courses on executive courses on big data and other topics that executives are coming to, and we're trying to walk the walk and apply these techniques to improving those courses as well.
Yeah, because to me, hiring is obviously a key part of it. It's also about how you help people make the transition, right? That you don't have a lost generation, which is something you talk about in the book, right? About the gap between when people can catch up, and if the technology continues to innovate, you can never catch up. So how do you take your workforce? How do you move people down that? Right? You don't want to lose all that intellectual capital.
Yeah, and the encouraging thing is there's a lot of challenges out there. The encouraging thing is that we're seeing companies like yours, we're seeing educational institutions come together to address this problem. Because the main problem that I see out there is we've talked to a lot of business leaders who say, look, the people that I get in the door, I have to treat as complete raw material and give them every skill that I think they need to do their job. You know, yuck. We have to be able to do a lot better than that.
I was amused by the way you opened your talk by talking about throwing colleagues under a bus.
Were you now?
I was curious how confident you are you're not going to be thrown under a bus in 5 years' time by
No, for sure. We know never to say never. We've already, I mean, what Andy also mentioned there was that we taught that book. And I was telling my students, these guys are right, you know, driving a car is a very good example. We would brainstorm. We'd have a group like this, and we'd all sit around talking. It was fun. What can machines do? What can't do? And it wasn't just me. I think most of the students, we all had kind of a consensus. And it's just a testament to this inflection point we're going through right now. And Andy and I try to keep up with exponential improvements and the digitization. And we talk about, we keep reminding ourselves, but our brains are just not wired to think about those kinds of transitions. So we keep being surprised. And so now, I expect to be surprised.
Right. And so Erik and I are going to be wrong about something fairly fundamental. I just don't know in which direction we're going to be wrong. Because we did not get the timing of the second machine age exactly right. There's a very small chance we got it exactly right. We talk to people who say, look, you guys are you're way too pessimistic about jobs and wages and economic growth and technology encroachment. And if we could actually let the innovators and the entrepreneurs do their work, we would bring back full employment, and there is still plenty of stuff that human beings are good for. So this dire employment and wage scenario you're laying out, going to be wrong.
One thing that's striking is that the people who think we're being too cautious tend to be the technologists. We got to Silicon Valley, we talked to the guys in the Media Lab, we talked to some of the folks around Route 128 in Boston, and
they say we're wrong the other way. They say, oh, this is coming much more quickly than you guys are saying.
So we're already working on something that's doing this thing. So maybe they're over-optimistic, we're not sure. But we need to change the conversation. We need to be thinking about these issues in a way to understand this tsunami that's coming towards us.
But James, that's kind of the point. Like, the point of what we're trying to do with this social science is you're going to put a hypothesis out there, you're going to try to state it as carefully as you can and not overclaim, here's the roadmap to the future. We're going to get some fairly, unless we're really, really better than everybody else, we're going to get some fairly fundamental things wrong. That's part of the process.
Right, so this is the second take at the argument, right? So your second take, more informed, more information, more feedback. What was the piece of the argument that you got back that was most coherent, that put you back on your heels and said, well, maybe we haven't really thought this through, that maybe we need to do a third book to address that argument?
Well, one of the things that was just the reaction to the first book was, I think, a lot more pessimistic than we intended it to be.
Okay.
And we are fundamentally optimists about that we will be able to address these challenges.
Right.
We've addressed them in the past. But we're not blind optimists. We're not techno-utopians who think that, hey, just sit back, it's all going to take care of itself. But I think that didn't come across as well in the first book. And in this new book, the last line of the book is, technology is not destiny, we shape our destiny. And that's an important credo that we want to get people thinking about this. And we can shape it in a way that turns out very good. In the first machine age, there were big changes in education, there were changes in corporate organization, there were changes in tax policy that helped turn that first machine age into something that create a lot of shared prosperity. We're hopeful that we can come up with similar inventions. It's not going to be enough just to redo what we did last time. And that ultimately leads us to be a little more optimistic than maybe people thought we were.
Cool. So, to Erik's point, it felt like every lazy journalist, after we wrote Race Against the Machine, every lazy journalist wanted to write a robots are eating our job story.
Or put one on 60 Minutes.
Wow. And they'd call us up to say, okay, you guys are Dr. Doom, right? Give us a quote. We're like, no, we like the future that we're creating. So we tried really hard in the new book, in Second Machine Age, to lead with the optimism, to provide a strong case for this great future that we're heading into. Still, every journalist writing a robots eating our job story calls us up to say, "Oh, great, you guys are the pessimists." It's easy. It's hard to change.
But it's a challenge. We do want to challenge people. We don't want people to get complacent either. There's this whole other group of people that you run into. We run into a lot that are like, "Hey, don't sweat it. Just sit back and enjoy the robot future of leisure," and we're not so comfortable about that either.
Yeah.
Let's go to some questions from the web. The first one's from Canada. I'm not sure, when I see the question, I'm not sure why it's come from Canada. How do you see this playing out in countries that are not as technologically advanced?
Wow. There's a lot of stuff there.
Wow.
I didn't say it. Where systems may not be as developed or managed.
I would kind of rather have the problems that we see in the US than almost any other country's challenges with the second machine age. Because for a lot of the 20th century, the way developing countries got up to a higher standard of living and greater prosperity was essentially by going through a sweatshop phase, where they were the factory for the world. Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, places like that. They moved into the knowledge work economy. They were fantastically successful at raising the standard of living of their people. As we look ahead and we think about robots and AI and the automation of so many different kinds of work, it's harder for me to see how countries are going to go have that productive, helpful sweatshop phase. So I don't know, for example, what the hundreds of millions of people in China and India are going to do as this technology keeps ticking ahead. The cute way to phrase it is, I think, after a few more ticks of Moore's law, the AI and the robots are going to work more cheaply than the Indians and the Chinese.
Right. Well, it's already happening. I mean, China is the #1 importer of industrial robots, and even so, a lot of that manufacturing is moving back to the United States and other countries. Apple, you may have heard, their new Mac Pro is being produced in what low-wage country? Austin, Texas. Yeah, not because there's low wages there, but because wages aren't a big part of the total
distribution
cost.
Is much more important.
And exactly. So you look at other kinds of things. And so, as Andy was saying, I agree 100%. I wouldn't really want to be in a country that's trying to compete on the basis of lower wages. Yeah. You compete with one of those robots by trying to have lower wages at Moore's Law's rate. That's not a very sustainable strategy. Better trying to do something fundamentally different, and that's going to be a bigger challenge for a lot of middle-income countries.
At the same time, though, the data are pretty clear. There has been no greater benefit to people in the developing world than the advent of these kinds of technologies. The mobile phone revolution, all of that, there's been no better news, no better economic news on the planet over the past couple decades.
There's a piece in your book, which I had never heard before, this quote that population growth didn't matter because the intellect that people brought was far more important. And this is really enabling that intellect, right?
Yeah,
we've got 7 billion people now for the first time in all of human history who are tapping into the world's global knowledge. There's a digital infrastructure that people can tap into, and not only tap into it and access it and use it, but contribute to it.
Right.
How can you not be optimistic when people are doing that? As long as they're not competing on the basis of low wages, they have to be competing on the basis of better ideas.
James is bringing up a great quote that we put in the book from Julian Simon, who I think is really one of the most underappreciated economists and thinkers of the 20th century, because he came out during this time of intense pessimism about resource depletion and population growth. He said, no, you guys don't get it. Population growth is not the problem. Population growth is the solution because it puts more brains on the planet who can solve our problems. It was completely radical thinking when he was saying it. We think he was absolutely right. It's crazy stuff, especially given the doom and gloom and stuff that we always hear. And then if you take that and you think about interconnecting those billions of people with technology and giving them access to really powerful pools of information and man, how could you not get incredibly optimistic about the innovation that we're going to see going forward? We foresee great things.
Great. Question from the room, perhaps, or shall I go back to the web?
Here's one right there.
I was wondering about the interface between machines and humans, so things like bionics or artificial enhancement of humans. It seems like that's one of the most intuitive ways in which humans being left behind will be mitigated or even solved. And I assume that in terms of inequality in society, that would be decided by who gets access to that kind of augmentation in bionics. So how do you guys see that playing out?
Well, there's some amazing things happening, and I'm going to be doing a panel this afternoon, and one of the panelists is Thad Starner, who has been wearing, you've all seen Google Glass. He's been wearing some version of that, not for a couple of years, for 21 years. He started wearing them back in his days at the MIT Media Lab. Of course, then it was like this big clunky.
He had a CRT terminal right
I hired
here.
one of his students to be one of my RAs, and he walked around with that. So he's very convinced about that is the future, and he points out that many people now walk around with iPhone earpads in there, and he said that's sort of the first step of us sort of being plugged into a different world while we're walking around. It's going to depend on what the cost of those technologies are. If they become cheap and ubiquitous, then it isn't necessarily something that limits to just a small number of people. But I think you're exactly on the right point. That last line we had in our talk about racing with machines, we'd like to see more entrepreneurs think about how can you use the technology to augment human skills, to get them to do things they never could have before, not take an existing job and replace it with a machine. That's not very creative, although it's effective. I mean, it does make money for the company. But take a human and a machine, put them together, and have them do something they could never do before. Just one quick example of how that can happen. As you may know, the chess champion of the world is no longer a human. But it's not a machine either. Deep Blue is not the best chess player. The chess champion of the world is a team of humans and computers working together. Even without the most powerful computer or the best grandmaster, if they work together effectively, they can beat either the best individual human or best individual machine. That, I think, is a nice metaphor for how you can solve all sorts of problems we couldn't solve previously by combining technology and human intellect.
You ask about biological augmentation. It's already going on. We are restoring hearing to the deaf via cochlear implants. We have the first FDA-approved retinal implants. We're going to bring sight back to the blind. Now, when I stop and think about that, that gets into miracle territory for me very quickly. How can this not be fantastic news? You ask about the cost. Clearly, these things are expensive when they're new. But a buddy of ours is Hal Varian, who's just one of the great economists of the information age. And he has my best way to look into the future. He says, look at what rich people have now, and then we'll all have that as technology marches ahead. And you're like, huh? And you think of Uber, and you're like, oh yeah, I summon a black car whenever I want. That's fantastic. So especially because of Moore's Law, these technologies are going to disperse very, very quickly into the hands of not just the rich. I'm blown away by that.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. I had a question about standards of living. So kind of to your point that you just mentioned right now, on balance, do you think that that positive story of technology changing our lives and free technology is really enabling us to do new things, basically, that's unprecedented? Or is it that kind of dire story of real wages going down, the middle and kind of lower income jobs going away? I mean, where do you think on balance we'll end up?
I mean, the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
So both of those phenomena are going on at once. The technology is racing ahead, and it's leaving a lot of people behind in their capacity as people who want to offer their labor to the economy. It's a very serious challenge. The other point you bring up, which is fundamentally important, is that whether or not you have a job, and it's better if you have a job, whether or not you have a job, technology is making your world better because it does increase our standard of living. It puts bounty into the world. It increases our processing power, our purchasing power. It's been doing that for more than 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution. Erik and I think that's accelerating because of digital technologies. So both of these things are absolutely going on. We meet too many people who are, I think, too focused on the job problems, and they're ignoring the bounty that comes from technology. We also met too many people who are so focused on the bounty stuff that they say, oh, don't worry about the silly jobs question. We got to get the balance right.
But the real thing to bear in mind, and I want to leave you with here, is that neither of those futures is inevitable. They're both possible, and there's a lot of other futures, some of them even more catastrophic, and some of them perhaps even better. We have more powerful technology than we've ever had before, which means we have more freedom to shape our future than ever before. The question isn't what's the technology going to do to us and what's going to happen to us passively as we watch it unfold. The question is, what do we want to have happen? What are our values? How do we choose to use the technology? We can turn the dial tremendously in terms of whether we create a future of shared prosperity, whether we connect more people, whether we have more widespread opportunity and education, or we can have much more concentration. There are a lot of choices we can make as individuals, as organizations, as society that will shape that future. And the most important thing to bear in mind, because your question comes up a lot, is that it's your choice and it's our choice as to which future we're going to have. If we take some of the recommendations we have in the book and come up with other ones, I think I'm optimistic we can choose and we will implement the happy future, but it's not at all inevitable.
Only if people read our book and follow it to the letter.
And with that, thanks very much. We could spend a lot more time talking, but we're out of time. Thank you very much, Erik and Andy. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.